In early 2025, the North American auto industry was rocked by a stunning announcement from President Donald Trump. The world watched as he stepped up to the podium, flanked by American flags, and delivered a message that would send shockwaves through the continent's economy. The United States would impose a sweeping 25% tariff on all cars and auto parts imported from Mexico and Canada, America's closest trading partners and the backbone of its automotive supply chain. This wasn't just a minor policy tweak, it was a seismic shift that threatened to unravel decades of cross-border cooperation and the deeply integrated supply chains that North American automakers depend on. For years, the USMCA had allowed parts and vehicles to move freely across borders, making North America a global powerhouse in automotive manufacturing. Factories in Detroit, Monterey, and Ontario worked in harmony, each specializing in different components, all relying on the promise of free trade. Now that system was suddenly in jeopardy. Automakers and workers alike faced massive uncertainty, unsure how to adapt to a new reality where costs could skyrocket overnight and jobs could be at risk. Automakers, who typically plan their production and investments years in advance, were blindsided by the abrupt policy change. Boardrooms across the continent scrambled to assess the impact, as executives pored over spreadsheets and tried to predict what would come next. A sudden 25% cost increase on imported parts and vehicles threw their careful planning into chaos. Production schedules, supplier contracts, and even future vehicle launches were all thrown into question. The industry's entire business model, built on the efficiencies of free trade and cross-border collaboration, now faced a fundamental challenge. Companies began to consider whether they could shift production, absorb the costs, or pass them on to consumers. This move impacts not just boardrooms and factory floors, but also hundreds of thousands of workers whose livelihoods depend on the auto industry, and millions of car buyers who could soon face higher prices and fewer choices. The tariff shockwave could reshape the price, availability, and types of vehicles on American roads for years to come, leaving a lasting mark on the way North Americans build, buy, and drive their cars. President Trump's plan is clear. He's proposing a bold and controversial move that could reshape the auto industry as we know it. The administration is calling for a sweeping 25% tariff on all vehicles and auto parts imported from Mexico and Canada, two of America's closest trading partners. This marks a dramatic shift from decades of relatively free trade under agreements like NAFTA and the USMCA, which have allowed cars and parts to move seamlessly across borders. The tariffs are intended as leverage to address broader issues, such as border security and immigration policy. But for the auto industry, the immediate concern is the financial impact, potentially billions of dollars in new costs. Over half of all U.S. auto parts, imports come from Mexico and Canada. That means even cars assembled in America, with American workers, rely heavily on foreign-made components. As a result, the price of so-called American-made vehicles is almost certain to rise. The tariffs are set to take effect in spring 2025, giving automakers and suppliers just months to prepare for a massive change. That's a tight deadline for an industry built on long-term planning and complex logistics. Companies can't simply reroute supply chains or build new factories overnight. Shifting production or sourcing new suppliers takes years of investment, planning, and negotiation. Meanwhile, the administration is also targeting Chinese goods with new tariffs, escalating tensions and creating a multi-front trade war that adds even more uncertainty for global manufacturers. Automakers like Tesla, which depend on a global network of suppliers for everything from batteries to electronics, are caught in the crossfire. They face tough choices about where to build, source, and sell their vehicles. The entire North American auto supply chain is now under threat. With costs rising from all directions, the future of car manufacturing in the region hangs in the balance, and consumers, workers, and businesses alike are bracing for impact. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum quickly condemned the tariffs, warning they would damage both economies. Mexico is a vital partner in North American auto manufacturing, with billions invested by major automakers. GM, for example, is the largest exporter of vehicles from Mexico to the U.S., including top-selling trucks. The tariffs threaten Mexico's industrial economy and regional stability. Sheinbaum urged the U.S. to reconsider, warning of broader consequences beyond car prices. Mexico is preparing for fallout but hopes for a diplomatic solution, emphasizing the value of USMCA. The government argues American consumers will ultimately pay the price. The stage is set for tense negotiations with the continent's economic health at stake. The announcement of a proposed 25% tariff sent shockwaves through Canada, a country whose economy is deeply intertwined with the U.S. auto industry. For many Canadians, the news was both unexpected and alarming, threatening the stability of a sector that supports hundreds of thousands of families across the nation. The auto industry is not just a source of national pride, but a vital economic engine, especially in provinces like Ontario. The U.S. and Canadian auto sectors are so closely linked that vehicles and parts often cross the border several times before a finished car rolls off the line. This seamless integration has been built over decades, making both countries stronger and more competitive on the global stage. Ontario, the heart of Canada's auto manufacturing, is home to major plants for Ford, GM, and Stellantis. These facilities are not only economic powerhouses, but also pillars of their communities, providing stable jobs and supporting local businesses. If the tariffs go into effect, Canadian-built cars would become far less competitive in the U.S. market. This could force plants to slow production or even shut down, putting thousands of jobs at risk and sending ripples through the broader Canadian economy. The blow is even harder for Canada's emerging electric vehicle sector. The loss of the U.S. EV tax credit, combined with new tariffs, threatens to derail Canada's ambitious plans to lead in green automotive technology and transition to a cleaner future. In response, Canadian officials are scrambling to secure exemptions and make their case in Washington. They warn that these tariffs will not only hurt Canadian workers but also disrupt supply chains and raise prices for American consumers. The two countries have spent over a century building a partnership based on trust and mutual benefit. Disrupting this system, officials argue, will raise costs, weaken North America's competitiveness, and threaten the prosperity of both nations. What began as shock has now become a determined, united effort. Canadian leaders, industry groups, and workers are all pushing to prevent a trade war and preserve the close economic ties that have defined the U.S.-Canada relationship for generations. As negotiations intensify, Canada is fighting not just for its auto industry, but for the future of its partnership with its closest ally, determined to protect jobs, communities, and a way of life. For GM and Ford, the tariffs are a nightmare scenario. GM imports hundreds of thousands of vehicles from Mexico and Canada, including its most profitable models. A 25% tariff would force them to either absorb huge losses or pass costs to consumers, risking sales. Ford faces similar risks, with major investments in both countries now in jeopardy. Automakers are scrambling to move inventory into the U.S. before tariffs hit, but that's only a short-term fix. Relocating production would take years and billions, with no guarantee of success. Even Tesla, assembling cars in the U.S., relies on foreign parts and faces rising costs. Retaliatory tariffs could hurt U.S. exports, squeezing profits further. The modern auto industry is so interconnected that no company is immune. The tariff tangle threatens every automaker regardless of where they build. For American car buyers, the bottom line is simple. Prices are set to rise, possibly by thousands of dollars. Automakers may absorb some costs, but most will be passed on to consumers. The tariffs apply to both vehicles and parts, so even US-assembled cars will get more expensive. Essential components like transmissions and engines often come from Mexico or Canada. Studies estimate tariffs could add up to $9,000 to some SUVs, and even affordable sedans will see price hikes. For families already struggling with high costs, this could put new cars out of reach. The result may be a slowdown in the auto market, hurting dealerships and workers alike. The intended protection could shrink the market and make new cars less accessible for millions. The ripple effect will be felt throughout the economy. The tariffs come at a critical moment for electric vehicles in the U.S. Many affordable new EVs, like GM's Equinox and Blazer, are built in Mexico and now face a 25% tariff. At the same time, the federal EV tax credit is set to be eliminated, removing a key incentive. This double hit could make EVs dramatically more expensive and slow their adoption. Automakers are rethinking EV investments, with some already delaying or canceling projects. Policy whiplash is chilling long-term investment in new technologies. For consumers, the promise of affordable EVs is fading, with fewer choices and higher prices. The U.S. risks falling behind Europe and China in the race for EV leadership. The future of North American autos is now deeply uncertain. If the tariffs remain, they'll force automakers to choose between absorbing costs, raising prices, or overhauling supply chains. The intended goal of bringing jobs back to the U.S. is complicated by high relocation costs and supply chain disruptions. Retaliatory tariffs from Mexico and Canada could hurt U.S. exports and jobs. For consumers, expect higher prices and fewer choices, pushing many out of the new car market. The era of affordable, diverse vehicles may be ending. The core question: is North America stronger as a team or as competitors? The new tariffs challenge decades of cooperation, risking a more adversarial relationship. The decisions made now will shape the industry and millions of livelihoods for years to come.